Find a comfortable place to settle in, perhaps under a warm blanket or by a window where the light is dim. The world outside can be loud, but here, we let the shadows tell their stories at a slower pace. Whether you are closing your eyes for the night, focusing on your work, or simply passing the time, you are in good company. We will wander through the strange, the unexplained, and the quiet corners of the unknown together. You are listening to Ambient Whispers. If these stories brought you comfort, please leave a like. We invite you to comment and tell us where this whisper was heard tonight. Please subscribe and let these stories be the embers that light your soul. Chapter 1. The Heavy Summer Air. The summer of 1967 did not arrive in Toledo with a breeze, but rather with a weight. It was July, and the air held the scent of damp pavement, lake water, and the faint, metallic tang of the nearby industries. In the evenings, the sun would hang low and orange, casting long, tired shadows across the residential streets. It was the kind of heat that made the world feel slow, as if time itself were moving through a thick, invisible syrup. Robert Richardson was a man who appreciated the quiet rhythms of such evenings. He was a person of habit, a man who found comfort in the predictable hum of his car engine and the familiar turns of the roads he had driven 1,000 times. On this particular night, the 20th of July, the world felt especially still. The birds had stopped their chatter, and the usual chorus of cicadas had fallen into a rhythmic, pulsing lullaby. He was driving his silver sedan along a stretch of road that felt more like a tunnel of green than a highway. The trees on either side leaned in, their leaves heavy with the dust of a dry month. The headlights of his car cut two yellow paths through the gathering dusk, illuminating the occasional moth that danced in the beams. Everything was soft. Everything was muted. Then the world shifted. As Robert rounded a gentle bend, the darkness ahead seemed to thicken, then tear. It was not a flash of light, but rather a sudden presence of something that did not belong to the woods or the sky. It was a shape, dark and polished like the back of a beetle, hovering just inches above the asphalt. It did not have wheels. It did not have windows. It simply occupied space in a way that felt wrong to the eye. There was no time for a sharp intake of breath, only the instinctual pressure of his foot on the brake. The tires did not scream. They gave a long, protesting hiss against the road. The car slowed, but the momentum carried it forward, a slow-motion dance toward the impossible. The collision was not a violent crash. There was no shattering of glass or the grinding of heavy steel. Instead, there was a dull, vibrating thud, like a drum being struck underwater. Robert felt the steering wheel tremble in his hands, a strange, electric hum passing through the column and into his palms. For a fleeting second, the front of his sedan pressed against the surface of the object. It felt soft, yet impenetrable. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the object was gone. It did not fly away with a roar. It did not vanish in a burst of light. It simply ceased to be there, as if the darkness had folded back over it. Robert sat in the sudden, ringing silence of his car. The engine had stalled. The headlights were still on, pointing at an empty road that looked exactly as it had moments before, save for the faint marks of his tires on the pavement. He sat there for a long time, listening to the cooling metal of his car engine make small, ticking sounds. The ping, ping, ping was the only thing breaking the silence of the Ohio night. His heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm, a thudding reminder that he was still there, sitting in the middle of a road that now felt like a foreign land. Eventually, Robert opened the door. The air outside was cooler than it had been, a sudden drop in temperature that sent a faint shiver down his spine. He stepped out, his shoes crunching softly on the grit of the road. He walked to the front of his car, expecting to see a crumpled hood or a shattered grille, but the damage was minor. There was a small dent, a gentle depression in the metal that looked more like a thumbprint than a collision mark. However, on the ground, lying right where the object had been, was a small, dull fragment. Robert knelt. The ground was cold to the touch. He reached out and picked up the piece of metal. It was no larger than a coin, irregularly shaped and surprisingly heavy for its size. In the dim light of his headlights, it didn't shine. It seemed to absorb the light, turning the yellow beams into a deep, matte gray. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger. It felt smooth, almost oily, though no residue stayed on his skin. It was warm, vibrating with a faint, lingering energy that made the tips of his fingers tingle. It was a souvenir of a moment that his mind was already trying to tell him hadn't happened. He tucked the fragment into his pocket, the weight of it pulling at the fabric of his trousers. He got back into his car, turned the key, and listened as the engine sputtered once, then caught. He drove home slowly, very slowly, watching the trees and the shadows, wondering if the world he had known for 31 years was still the same world he was driving through now. The quiet following. The days following the encounter were lived in a sort of haze. Robert went to work. He ate his meals, and he spoke to his neighbors, but everything felt secondary to the weight in his pocket. He had placed the metal fragment in a small velvet-lined box he kept on his nightstand. Every night before turning out the lamp, he would open the box and look at it. It never changed. It didn't rust. It didn't lose its warmth. He began to talk about it, but only in hushed tones and only to those he trusted. He told a few friends at the local diner, over mugs of black coffee that smelled of chicory and steam. He described the way the object had looked like polished obsidian and how it had moved without a sound. He showed them the fragment, letting them feel the strange, unnatural weight of it. Word travels slowly in a cozy town, but it travels deep. It moves through the telephone wires and over backyard fences. It drifts through the air of hardware stores and pharmacies. By the end of the week, the story of Robert Richardson and his piece of the sky had reached ears that Robert never intended to hear it. On the fourth day, the atmosphere in his home began to change. The house, a modest two-story with white siding and a porch that groaned when you stepped on the left corner, usually felt like a sanctuary. But now the silence felt different. It felt observed. Robert noticed it first in the way his dog, a gentle retriever named Barney, would sit by the front door. Barney wouldn't bark. He would simply stare at the wood of the door, his ears slightly cocked, his tail still. When Robert called him, the dog would move slowly, casting glances back at the entryway as if someone were standing just on the other side of the threshold. Then there were the cars. Toledo was a busy enough place, but Robert lived on a cul-de-sac where the traffic was predictable. You knew the sound of the neighbor's station wagon and the postman's jeep. But a new sound had entered the neighborhood. It was a low, smooth purr, the sound of a high-end engine that didn't belong to any of the local workers. A black sedan, polished to a mirror finish, began to appear at the end of the street. It would sit there for an hour, then disappear, only to return at dusk. It had no license plate frames, no bumper stickers, and the windows were tinted so darkly that they looked like sheets of black ice. Robert would watch it from behind his curtains, his hand instinctively reaching for the box on his nightstand. He felt a creeping sense of unease, not a sharp fear, but a slow, cold realization that he had taken something that was never meant to be held. He felt like a child who had found a fallen star and didn't realize that the sky might want it back. The air in the house grew thick with the smell of ozone, the same scent that lingers after a lightning strike. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it stayed in the back of his throat. He cleaned the floors, he aired out the rooms, but the scent remained, a ghostly reminder of the metallic hum he had felt through his steering wheel. One evening, as the sun was setting and painting the walls of his living room in shades of bruised purple and gold, the telephone rang. Robert answered it. There was no one on the other end, at least, not in the traditional sense. There was no breathing, no clicking of a line. Instead, there was a sound like a distant radio station, a soft, rhythmic pulsing of static that seemed to sync with the beating of his own heart. He stayed on the line for 3 minutes, frozen, until the sound simply faded away into a dial tone. He hung up the phone with a shaking hand. He knew then that the encounter on the road was not over. The minor collision had been an introduction, and the main event was currently parking at the end of his driveway. The visitors arrive. It happened on a Tuesday. The rain had been falling in a gentle, persistent drizzle since dawn, turning the world into a palette of grays and greens. Robert was in his kitchen, the radio playing a soft jazz melody that felt mismatched with the tension in his chest. He was nursing a cup of tea, watching the raindrops race down the window pane. There was a knock at the door. It wasn't a loud knock. It was 3 distinct measured taps. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of someone who knew exactly how much force was required to be heard, and not a fraction more. Robert stood still. Barney, usually a friendly welcomer of guests, did not move from his spot under the kitchen table. The dog's hackles were raised, and a low, continuous rumble emanated from his throat, a sound Robert had never heard him make before. Robert walked to the front door. He straightened his shirt, a simple blue flannel, and wiped his palms on his trousers. He took a deep breath, the scent of ozone now suddenly very strong, and turned the handle. Standing on his porch were 2 men. They looked remarkably similar, though not like brothers. It was more as if they had been designed from the same blueprint. They were tall, perhaps 6 feet and 3 inches, and wore identical charcoal gray suits. The fabric of the suits looked heavy and expensive, yet there wasn't a single drop of rain on them, despite the downpour behind them. Their white shirts were crisp, and their black ties were knotted with mathematical precision. But it was their faces that made Robert's stomach turn into a knot of cold lead. Their skin was pale, an even waxen color that seemed to lack the natural imperfections of a human face. They had no lines around their eyes, no shadows under their chins. Their eyes were dark, not brown or black, but a deep, fathomless void that didn't seem to reflect the light of the hallway. The man on the left spoke first. His voice was flat, devoid of any accent or emotion. It sounded like a recording played at a slightly slower speed than intended. "Good evening, Mr. Richardson," the man said. He didn't use a questioning tone. It was a statement of fact. Robert leaned against the door frame, trying to maintain his composure. "Can I help you gentlemen with something? It's a bit wet out for a stroll." The men did not smile. They did not blink. "We are here regarding the property," the second man said. His voice was an exact replica of the first. "The fragment you recovered on the evening of July 20th. It is a matter of safety. It must be returned." Robert felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "I don't know what you're talking about. I had a bit of a car accident, that's all. Some road debris." The 2 men stepped forward in unison, a movement so synchronized it felt rehearsed. They didn't push their way in, but their presence was so overwhelming that Robert found himself stepping back into the foyer to make room. They entered his home, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Mr. Richardson," the first man said, his dark eyes fixed on Robert's. "The material is not stable in this environment. It is losing its integrity. For your well-being and the well-being of this neighborhood, we require its return." They stood in his living room, two dark pillars against the cozy backdrop of his floral-patterned wallpaper and his grandmother's antique clock. The clock, which usually ticked with a comforting tock-tock, seemed to stumble, the pendulum swinging with an irregular, jerky motion. I gave it to a laboratory," Robert lied, his voice cracking slightly. "They're testing it. It's not here." The men turned their heads to look at each other, then back to Robert. It was a slow, mechanical movement. "That is incorrect," the second man said. "The fragment is within 40 feet of our current position. It is upstairs in a small box on a nightstand." The level of detail was a physical blow. Robert felt his legs grow weak. He looked toward the stairs, then back at the men. They weren't threatening him with weapons. They weren't raising their voices, but the sheer certainty in their presence was more terrifying than any threat. "Who are you?" Robert whispered. "We are interested parties." The first man replied, "We represent the owners of the craft you encountered. We would like to conclude this matter quietly. We do not wish to cause any further disruptions to your life." The word disruptions hung in the air like a cloud of smoke. Robert thought of the black sedan at the end of the street. He thought of the silent phone calls. He thought of Barney, who was now whimpering quietly under the table. "Wait here," Robert said. He walked up the stairs, his footsteps feeling heavy and clumsy. He reached his bedroom and went straight to the nightstand. He opened the velvet box. The fragment was there, glowing with a faint, pulsing light that he hadn't noticed before. It felt hot now, almost burning. He picked it up, and for a moment he considered throwing it out the window or hiding it in the attic. But he knew it wouldn't matter. They knew where it was. They knew everything. He walked back down the stairs, the small piece of metal tucked into his palm. When he reached the living room, the two men were standing exactly where he had left them. They hadn't moved an inch. They hadn't looked at his books or his photos. They simply waited. Robert held out his hand and opened it. The man on the left reached out. His fingers were long and thin, and his touch was as cold as a block of ice. As soon as his skin brushed the fragment, the metal seemed to hum, a high-pitched frequency that made Robert's teeth ache. The man closed his hand over the fragment and tucked it into his pocket. "Thank you, Mr. Richardson," the man said. "Is that it?" Robert asked, his voice trembling. "Is it over?" The two men began to walk toward the door. They moved with a strange, gliding gait, their feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. "For now," the second man said as they reached the porch. "We suggest you do not speak of this further. Memories can be unreliable. It is better for everyone if this night is forgotten." They stepped out into the rain. Robert watched from the doorway. They walked down his path and toward the street, but they didn't get into the black sedan. They simply walked into the shadows of the large oak trees at the edge of his property. By the time Robert blinked, they were gone. The rain continued to fall, a soft, rhythmic patter on the roof. The smell of ozone began to dissipate, replaced by the scent of wet earth and grass. Robert closed the door and locked it. He went into the kitchen and sat at the table. Barney finally came out from under the table and rested his head on Robert's knee. The dog was shaking. Robert looked at his hand. There was a small, red mark where the metal had rested, a faint circular burn that would take weeks to heal. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was ticking normally again. Tock, tock, tock. He realized then that he was exhausted. a deep, bone-weary tiredness that made his eyes feel heavy. He didn't want to call the police. He didn't want to call his friends. He just wanted the silence of the night to be normal again. He turned off the lights one by one and climbed the stairs. He looked at the empty velvet box on his nightstand. It looked lonely. He climbed into bed and pulled the blankets up to his chin, listening to the rain. The world was quiet. The mystery was gone, or at least it had been reclaimed. But Robert Richardson knew as he drifted into a heavy, dreamless sleep that he would never look at the night sky the same way again. He would always be looking for a shape in the dark, a hum in the air, and the sound of 3 measured knocks on a wooden door. Chapter 2. The Lingering Shadow. The morning after the visit was unnervingly bright. The rain from the previous night had washed the sky into a pale, translucent blue, and the air smelled of freshly turned earth and wet pavement. Robert Richardson woke up late, his limbs feeling as heavy as if they had been cast in lead. For a few moments, he lay in the quiet of his bedroom, watching the dust motes dance in a shaft of sunlight, and tried to convince himself that the 2 men in the charcoal suits had been a fragment of a fevered dream. But when he sat up, the dull ache in his palm remained. He opened his hand and looked at the faint, red circular mark where the fragment had rested. It was a physical anchor to a memory that felt like it was already trying to dissolve at the edges. He walked downstairs, the floorboards creaking with their usual familiar groans. Barney was already in the kitchen, sitting by his empty food bowl, but the dog was uncharacteristically subdued. He didn't wag his tail or offer the soft woof that usually greeted the morning. He simply watched Robert with wide, soulful eyes, his ears flattened slightly against his head. Robert moved through the motions of making coffee. The ritual was a comfort. The scooping of the dark grounds, the steady pour of the water, the rhythmic gurgle of the machine. He found himself staring out the kitchen window at the spot where the black sedan had parked the night before. The street was empty now. A neighbor was pushing a lawnmower 3 houses down, the distant drone of the engine a mundane and reassuring sound. Yet as the day progressed, the cozy normalcy of Toledo felt thin, like a veil that might tear again at any moment. Robert tried to go about his business. He spent the afternoon in his small backyard, tending to the marigolds that lined the fence. The sun was warm on his neck, and the soil was cool beneath his fingernails. It was a grounding task, something that required his full attention. But every time a car turned the corner at the end of the block, his heart would skip a beat, and his hand would instinctively tighten around the handle of his trowel. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the visitors returned. Not the men in suits, but a different kind of curiosity. A knock came at the door, but this one was different. It was heavy, hurried, and lacked the mathematical precision of the previous night. When Robert opened the door, he found a man standing there who looked like he had been pulled straight from a university library. He was rumpled, wearing a corduroy jacket that was far too warm for a July afternoon, and carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen better decades. "Mr. Richardson," the man said, breathing heavily. He wiped sweat from his brow with a checkered handkerchief. "My name is Bender. I've heard some very interesting rumors about a certain discovery you made on the road last week." Robert felt a flash of irritation mixed with a weary sort of dread. "I told the other fellas the piece is gone. I don't have anything for you." The man's eyes widened. "Other fellas? You mean the gentlemen in the dark suits? They've already been here." The way the man said, "gentlemen," made it sound like a warning. He looked over his shoulder at the empty street, his movements jerky and nervous. "Mr. Richardson, if you have a moment, I think it would be in your best interest if we spoke. I'm not with the government, and I'm certainly not with them. I'm a researcher. I study things that aren't supposed to exist." Robert hesitated. He wanted to close the door and return to his quiet house, but there was something in the man's frantic energy that felt honest. It was the energy of a man who was genuinely afraid, rather than the cold, calculated presence of the visitors from the night before. "Come in," Robert said, stepping aside. "But the coffee is cold." The researcher's tale. They sat in the living room, the same room where the two men had stood like statues only hours ago. The researcher, who introduced himself as Albert, didn't sit back in the armchair. He perched on the edge of it, his hands clasped tightly together. "You don't understand the gravity of what you found, Robert," Albert whispered, his voice barely audible over the ticking of the grandfather clock. "That fragment, it wasn't just metal. Based on the reports I've gathered from other encounters, these materials are often isotopic. They don't belong to our periodic table. They are manufactured in environments we can't even simulate on Earth." Robert looked at his palm, at the fading red mark. They took it back. They knew exactly where it was. They knew it was in a velvet box on my nightstand before they even stepped into the house. Albert nodded slowly, a grim expression on his face. "They have ways of sensing the frequency. To them, that metal is like a beacon. It pulses, it sings. You can't hide it from them any more than you could hide a lighthouse in a fog." The two men sat in silence for a while. The room felt smaller than it had that morning. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, and the air had grown still. Robert described the encounter on the road in detail. The way the craft looked like a beetle's back, the lack of sound, the strange softness of the impact. Albert took notes in a small, leather-bound notebook, his pen scratching across the paper with a rhythmic, soothing sound. It was the first time Robert had felt heard rather than interrogated. "They are called the men in black in some circles," Albert said, not looking up from his notes. "They appear after sightings, usually to recover debris or to silence witnesses. They aren't quite human, Robert, or if they are, they've been adjusted." "Adjusted?" Robert asked, a chill running down his spine. "Their speech, their movements, it's like they're wearing a human costume that doesn't quite fit," Albert replied. "They don't eat, they don't sleep. They have one purpose: to keep the mystery a mystery." As Albert spoke, the atmosphere in the house shifted again. It wasn't the smell of ozone this time, but a heavy, static charge that made the hair on Robert's arms stand up. The radio in the kitchen, which had been turned off, suddenly emitted a burst of white noise. Albert froze. He dropped his pen. "They're watching the house." Robert walked to the window and peeled back the curtain. The black sedan wasn't there. The street was still empty, but as he looked up, he saw something that made his breath catch. High above the neighborhood, sitting perfectly still against the orange glow of the setting sun, was a faint, shimmering distortion. It wasn't a cloud. It looked like a ripple in a pond, a distortion of the air itself. It stayed there for a moment, then slowly drifted behind a bank of clouds. "They're not just on the ground," Robert whispered. Albert stood up, his face pale. "I have to go. If I stay here, I become part of the record, and I'm not ready for that. Mr. Richardson, listen to me. They have the fragment, so they might leave you alone now. But don't go looking for answers. Don't go back to that road. Some things are meant to stay in the dark." The researcher gathered his things with trembling hands and practically ran to the door. Robert watched him pull away in a beat-up blue station wagon, his tires chirping against the asphalt. Robert was alone again. He walked through his house, checking the locks. He felt like a man living in a glass box, visible from every angle to something he couldn't see. He went to the kitchen and began to wash the two coffee mugs, the warm water and the bubbles of the soap providing a small domestic comfort. But as he looked down into the sink, he saw it. Resting at the bottom of the basin, under the soapy water, was a tiny, shimmering sliver of gray. It was no larger than a grain of rice, a tiny piece of the fragment that must have broken off when he had handled it. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had lied to the men. He hadn't meant to, but he still had a piece of it. A tiny, microscopic anchor to the unknown. He reached into the water and picked it up. It was cold, colder than the water, colder than ice. It felt like a needle of winter sitting in his palm. He looked at the kitchen door. He looked at the shadows stretching across the linoleum floor. The cozy safety of his home felt like an illusion. He realized then that the encounter wasn't a story that had ended. It was a story that was just beginning to unfold, and he was the unwilling protagonist. The night of whispers. That night, Robert didn't sleep in his bed. He moved a blanket and a pillow to the living room sofa, keeping Barney close to his feet. He left a small lamp on in the corner, its yellow light casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The house was full of sounds. The settling of the wood, the wind brushing against the eaves, the distant hum of the city. But beneath those sounds there was something else, a whisper. It wasn't a human voice. It was a vibration, a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate in the bones of his skull. It was the same sound the fragment had made when the man in the gray suit had touched it. It was a song of metal and stars, a sound that felt older than the earth itself. Robert held the tiny sliver of metal in a glass jar, which he placed on the coffee table in front of him. He watched it. In the dim light, the sliver seemed to vibrate, creating tiny ripples in the air around it. He thought about his life before July 20th. He thought about the simple joy of a Sunday drive, the taste of a cold beer on a hot afternoon, the predictable comfort of his job at the tool and die shop. All of that felt like it belonged to a different person. He was no longer just Robert Richardson, a citizen of Toledo, Ohio. He was a witness. He was a keeper of a secret that the world wasn't ready to hear. Around 3 in the morning, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was a heavy, expectant silence, like the moment before a storm breaks. Barney growled, a low, wet sound. Robert looked toward the front door. He didn't hear a knock. He didn't hear footsteps, but he saw the shadows beneath the door change. 2 dark shapes obscured the moonlight that usually spilled through the crack at the bottom of the frame. They were back. Robert didn't move. He sat on the sofa, his breath shallow, his hand resting on Barney's head. He waited for the knock, for the handle to turn, for the men to demand the final piece of their property. But the knock never came. Instead, a voice drifted through the wood of the door. It wasn't the flat, mechanical voice from before. It was a whisper, 1,000 voices speaking at once, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "Keep it," the voice said. Robert felt a chill that turned his blood to slush. "Keep it as a reminder." The voice continued, the sound echoing in his mind rather than his ears. "A reminder that we are here. A reminder that the world is not as small as you believe. We will return for the rest of you in time." The shadows beneath the door vanished. The heavy pressure in the air lifted, and the scent of ozone was replaced by the sweet, cloying smell of night-blooming jasmine from the neighbor's garden. Robert sat in the dark for a long time, the jar with the tiny sliver of metal glowing faintly on the table. He realized that they hadn't come to take the last piece. They had come to leave a mark. They wanted him to remember. They wanted him to know that he was watched. As the first light of dawn began to gray the windows, Robert Richardson finally closed his eyes. He didn't sleep, but he drifted in a state of quiet reflection. He thought about the vastness of the universe, the mysteries hidden in the dark corners of the Ohio woods, and the strange, cold visitors who walked among men in charcoal suits. The story of the Robert Richardson encounter would eventually become a footnote in the annals of the unexplained. People would talk about the metal, the men in black, and the dent in the silver sedan. But for Robert, it wasn't a story. It was a change in the frequency of his life. He would live many more years in that house in Toledo. He would continue to garden, to work, and to walk his dog. But every July, when the air grew thick and the scent of ozone drifted on the breeze, he would sit on his porch and look up at the stars. And in the back of his mind, he would hear the faint, metallic hum of a world that didn't belong to him, and he would feel the cold weight of the secret he kept in a small glass jar, hidden away in the dark. Chapter 3. The Weight of Evidence. The weeks following the visit from the two men were marked by a silence so profound it felt heavy. Robert Richardson tried to return to his routine, but the world had lost its luster. The silver sedan, once his pride, sat in the driveway like a wounded animal. The small dent on the bumper remained, a physical scar from a collision with the impossible. But Robert was not the only one who could not let the event rest. The story had reached the ears of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, known as APRO. Based in Tucson, Arizona, they were a group of dedicated individuals, scientists, engineers, and former military men, who believed that the truth of the UFO phenomenon lay in physical evidence, not just stories. In early August, a letter arrived for Robert. It was typed on crisp, white stationery with a professional letterhead. The tone was respectful, a far cry from the cold demands of the men in black. They wanted to see the car. They wanted to see the road. And most importantly, they wanted to know if any of the material remained. Robert sat at his kitchen table, the letter held between his fingers. He looked at the glass jar hidden in the back of his pantry, tucked behind a bag of flour. The tiny sliver of metal still sat there, silent and cold. He decided to answer. A few days later, a man named Jim Lorenzen, a representative of the research group, arrived in Toledo. Unlike the previous visitors, Jim was warm. He wore a simple short-sleeved shirt and carried a camera and a notebook. He didn't loom, he sat at the kitchen table and listened. He treated Robert not as a subject, but as a witness to history. "You aren't crazy, Robert," Jim said softly, his voice a comforting baritone. "We've seen the reports." The 1960s have been a busy decade for these visitors. From West Virginia to the outskirts of Lake Erie, people are seeing things that shouldn't be there. They spent the afternoon at the site of the collision. The road was still there, winding through the dense Ohio greenery. The trees stood silent, their leaves beginning to show the faintest tinges of autumn gold. Robert pointed to the exact spot where the dark, beetle-like craft had hovered. Jim knelt on the asphalt, his magnifying glass out. He examined the pavement where Robert had slammed on his brakes. "Look here," Jim whispered. He pointed to a section of the road that looked almost vitrified, as if it had been subjected to intense, localized heat. The asphalt had a glassy sheen that didn't match the rest of the worn road. It was a perfect circle, roughly 2 feet in diameter. "This is consistent with an electromagnetic field," Jim explained, his pen scratching across his notebook. "It doesn't burn the road like fire. It rearranges the molecules." The atmosphere was cozy, the sun warm on their backs, yet a sense of spooky wonder hung in the air. Here was proof. Not a story, not a ghost, but a physical change in the earth itself. The laboratory analysis. Robert eventually showed Jim the sliver. He didn't tell him about the voices at the door or the feeling of being watched, but he handed over the jar. "This is all that's left," Robert said. "They took the rest." Jim took the fragment back to the laboratories affiliated with APRO. For months, Robert heard nothing. He went back to his life, working the late shifts at the shop, the hum of the machinery providing a steady rhythm to his days. But in the quiet moments of his commute, he would glance at the dashboard of his car and remember the feeling of the steering wheel vibrating under his palms. In October, the report arrived. The analysis was chilling in its clinical detail. The fragment was composed of a magnesium alloy. On the surface, that sounded mundane. Magnesium was used in flares, in aircraft, and in medicine. But the laboratory had found something that shouldn't have been possible. The isotopic ratio of the magnesium was wrong. In nature, on Earth, magnesium has a specific signature. It is like a fingerprint left by the birth of our solar system. But the fragment Robert Richardson had recovered from that lonely road in Toledo did not match that fingerprint. The report stated that the material could only have been manufactured in a high-energy environment, perhaps in the heart of a star different from our own, or through a process of molecular assembly that human science had not yet mastered. Furthermore, the lab noted that the metal was chemically pure, to a degree that defied the manufacturing standards of 1967. It was as if the metal had been grown, atom by atom, rather than forged in a fire. Robert read the report by the light of a single lamp. The words, extraterrestrial origin, were never used, but the implication was a cold weight in the room. He realized that for a few days he had held a piece of another world in his pocket. He had carried the stars in his trousers. The vanishing, as winter began to settle over Ohio, the cozy spooky nature of the encounter took a final, strange turn. Robert began to notice that the evidence was disappearing, not from his house, but from the world. He tried to contact Jim Lorenzen again, but the phone lines were often under repair. When he finally got through, Jim sounded different. His voice was tired, guarded. He told Robert that the laboratory samples had been misplaced during a transfer between facilities. Then came the visits from the local authorities. They weren't the men in black. They were men in blue uniforms, men Robert had seen at the diner. They came with questions about his accident. They suggested that perhaps the dent in his car was from a fallen branch, or perhaps he had hit a deer and forgotten. "It's a lot of excitement for one man, Robert," a deputy told him, leaning against the porch railing. "People start talking. It's not good for the town. It's not good for your reputation. Maybe it's best if we just call it a fender bender and move on." The pressure was subtle, like the slow cooling of the earth in November. It wasn't a threat, it was an erasure. They weren't taking his memory, they were making it irrelevant. Robert looked at the deputy, a man he had known for 10 years. He saw the flicker of unease in the deputy's eyes. He realized then that it wasn't just the men in black who wanted the secret kept. The world itself, the comfortable, predictable, cozy world of 1967, could not handle the weight of what he had found. People wanted to sleep. They wanted to work. They didn't want to think about beetle-shaped crafts and isotopic magnesium. Robert nodded slowly. "You're right, Bill. It was a long night. I probably just hit a deer." The deputy smiled, a look of genuine relief washing over his face. "Good man, Robert. Good man." When the deputy left, Robert went inside. He walked to the pantry and looked behind the bag of flour. The glass jar was gone. He hadn't moved it. His house had been locked. Barney hadn't barked. The visitors had returned one last time while he was at work. They didn't want to talk. They didn't want to warn him. They simply tidied up the last loose end of their presence in Toledo. The final reflection. The story of the Robert Richardson encounter fades into the snows of the late 60s. Robert lived out his life in that same house. He became a man known for his quiet nature and his beautiful garden. He never spoke of the encounter in public again. But every year on the 20th of July, he would drive out to that stretch of road. He would pull his car over to the shoulder, turn off the engine, and sit in the silence. He would look at the asphalt, now patched and repaved by the city, and remember the glassy circle that had once been there. He would feel the faint, phantom vibration in his palms. He wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had been replaced by a strange, melancholic peace. He knew something that the rest of the world chose to ignore. He knew that the veil between the known and the unknown was as thin as a summer mist. As the years passed and the 1960s gave way to the 70s and beyond, Robert found comfort in the mystery. It made the world feel larger, more wondrous, and infinitely more complex. The cozy life he led was shadowed by the spooky truth, and he found he preferred it that way. The stars above Toledo were the same stars everyone else saw, but to Robert they were a neighborhood. And somewhere up there in the vast velvet dark was a craft with a small dent in its hull, a mark made by a silver sedan and a man who, for one brief moment, touched the impossible. The snow began to fall outside his window, large, soft flakes that muffled the sound of the world. Robert turned off the lamp, the click of the switch echoing in the quiet room. He climbed into bed, the blankets warm and heavy. "Good night, Barney," he whispered to the old dog sleeping at the foot of the bed. The world was still. The mystery was safe. And Robert Richardson, the man who met the stars on a Tuesday night, finally let the silence take him into a peaceful, dreamless sleep. Chapter 1. The Silver Bridge and the Heavy Sky. The town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, sits at the confluence of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers. In 1966, it was a place of iron, coal, and deep ancient forests. The air there always felt a little thicker than elsewhere, carrying the scent of river mud and the faint, sulphurous tang of industry. It was a cozy town, where neighbors waved from porches and the local diner was the heart of the community. But beneath that layers of domestic peace, something was beginning to stir. The winter of 1966 didn't arrive with snow at first, but with a gray, pressing gloom that seemed to settle over the valley like a damp blanket. The trees, stripped of their leaves, looked like skeletal fingers reaching for a sky that never quite brightened. It was in this atmosphere of muted colors and long shadows that the first reports began to surface. People spoke of a creature. They called it the Mothman, though the name felt too small for the dread it inspired. They described it as a man-sized figure with wings that didn't flap, and eyes that glowed with a fierce, hypnotic red. It haunted the TNT area, a sprawling, abandoned explosives manufacturing site from the Second World War, filled with rusted igloos and crumbling concrete. But as the sightings of the winged creature increased, so did a different kind of anomaly. While the Mothman was a phantom of the woods, a more human, yet equally alien, presence began to haunt the streets of Point Pleasant itself. It started with the cars. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's vehicle, the appearance of a new car was always noticed. But these were not just any cars. They were large, black Cadillacs, polished to a shine that seemed impossible given the muddy winter roads of West Virginia. They appeared to be brand new, yet they were models from years prior, looking as though they had been kept in a vacuum since they left the factory. They didn't drive like the locals. They moved with a slow, predatory grace, gliding through the residential areas at 2 in the morning, their headlights casting long, cold beams onto the sides of houses. They never seemed to stop for gas. They never stopped at the local markets. They simply were. Mary Heyer, a local reporter for the Messenger, was one of the first to notice the shift in the town's energy. Mary was a woman of sharp intuition and a kind heart. She spent her days listening to the stories of the townspeople, documenting the strange lights in the sky and the footprints found in the mud. But soon, her notes began to fill with descriptions of men in black suits. They began to appear in the local diners, sitting at the far booths. They would order water or perhaps a black coffee, but the waitresses noticed they rarely drank. They sat perfectly still, their backs straight, their eyes fixed on the other patrons. They didn't talk among themselves. They didn't read the paper. They just watched. The suits they wore were out of place for a rural river town. They were made of a heavy, dark fabric that seemed to absorb the light. Their shirts were a blinding, clinical white, and their ties were narrow and black. Even in the dampest, most humid West Virginia afternoon, these men never appeared to sweat. Their skin remained pale and dry like old parchment. It's like they're waiting for something, Mary whispered to a friend one evening as they walked past the park. Like they're waiting for the world to end, and they want to make sure they have a front row seat. The atmosphere in Point Pleasant was no longer just cozy and quiet. It was becoming heavy with a sense of being observed. The mystery of the Mothman was the spark, but the men in black were the cold, steady flame that kept the town on edge. Chapter 2. The knock at the door. The first recorded visit to a private home happened in late November. The resident was a woman named Marcella, who lived in a small, tidy house near the edge of the TNT area. She had reported seeing a large, bird-like shape outside her window 3 nights prior. It was 7 o'clock in the evening. The sun had long since dipped behind the hills, and the only light came from the soft glow of her television. There was a knock at the door, 3 slow, deliberate thuds. When Marcella opened the door, she expected a neighbor or perhaps a wandering hunter. Instead, she found a man who looked like he had been cut out of a different reality. He was tall, with high cheekbones and eyes that were slightly tilted, giving him an almost regal yet unsettling appearance. "Good evening," the man said. His voice was melodic, but it lacked the natural ups and downs of human speech. It felt like a song played on a synthesizer. "We are interested in the bird." Marcella felt a sudden, sharp coldness in her chest. "The bird? You mean the thing people are seeing in the woods?" The man didn't blink. "It is not a bird. It is a biological anomaly. We would like to know if you have any physical mementos, feathers, pellets, anything left behind." He didn't ask to come in, but he leaned forward slightly, and Marcella felt an overwhelming urge to step back. The air around him smelled of ozone and something sweet, like rotting lilies. It was a scent that didn't belong to the crisp November night. "I don't have anything," Marcella stammered. "I just saw it. I didn't go out there." The man stared at her for a long, uncomfortable minute. His eyes didn't seem to focus on her face, but rather through it, as if he were reading the electrical impulses of her brain. "That is unfortunate," the man said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver coin. It was perfectly smooth with no markings on either side. "If you find anything, you will place it under the oak tree in your yard. We will know." He turned and walked away. He didn't go to a car. He simply walked into the shadows of the woods, his black suit disappearing into the darkness almost instantly. Marcella closed the door and locked it. She felt a deep, primal fear, the kind of fear that makes the hair on your neck stand up. It wasn't the fear of a predator, but the fear of the unknown. She realized that the Mothman was only part of the story. There was a structure to the madness, a group of individuals who were managing the event, and they didn't care about the people of Point Pleasant. As the weeks went on, more stories surfaced. A man driving home late at night was followed for 10 miles by a black Cadillac that stayed exactly 50 feet behind him, regardless of his speed. When he finally pulled over into a brightly lit gas station, the Cadillac glided past, and he saw 4 men inside, all wearing identical black hats, staring straight ahead. A local farmer found his cattle behaving strangely, huddling in the center of the field and refusing to eat. When he went out to check on them, he found 2 men in suits standing near the fence, holding a device that looked like a long, silver rod. When they saw him, they didn't run. They simply stood there until he got within 20 feet, and then they were gone. Not running, not hiding, just gone. The town was being mapped. Every sighting, every footprint, every terrified scream was being recorded by these silent observers. Chapter 3. The Frequency of Fear. By December of 1966, the cozy spooky vibe of Point Pleasant had shifted toward the surreal. The local high schoolers who used to go to the TNT area to test their bravery now stayed home. The streets were quiet by 8 o'clock. The only sound was the rushing of the Ohio River and the occasional distant cry of an owl or something else. John Keel, a journalist and researcher, arrived in town during this time. He was a man who had traveled the world looking for the strange, but even he was unprepared for Point Pleasant. He stayed at the Low Hotel, a grand, old-fashioned building with creaking floors and high ceilings. Keel noticed that his telephone was acting strangely. Whenever he spoke to a witness, there would be a series of clicks and pops on the line. Sometimes he would hear a third party breathing, a heavy, rhythmic sound that didn't belong to the person he was talking to. One night, Keel received a phone call from a voice that identified itself as Indrid Cold. The voice was bizarre. It sounded like it was being projected from a great distance with a strange metallic echo. It spoke in riddles mentioning events that hadn't happened yet and details about Keel's private life that no one in West Virginia could possibly know. "The bridge will be the key," the voice whispered. "The silver span will groan under the weight of the stars." Keel began to realize that the Mothman sightings were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger phenomenon, a window area, where the boundaries between dimensions were thinning. The men in black were the guardians of that window, or perhaps the janitors, cleaning up the traces of the visitors. He began to see them everywhere. He saw them standing on the street corners, their dark suits a sharp contrast to the colorful Christmas decorations that were beginning to appear in the shop windows. He saw them in the reflection of his rearview mirror. He even saw one in the lobby of the Low Hotel, sitting in a wingback chair, staring at a blank wall for 3 hours. When Keel tried to approach one of them, the man simply stood up and walked toward the elevators. Keel followed, but when the doors opened on the 4th floor, the hallway was empty. There was no way the man could have reached a room so quickly. The men in black were not just prowling the town. They were infiltrating the psyche of the residents. People began to report missing time, gaps in their memory where they couldn't account for an hour or 2 of their day. They would wake up in their cars on the side of the road, the engine still running, with no memory of how they got there. And always there was the scent, the smell of ozone, the smell of something old and metallic. The cozy, familiar world of Point Pleasant was being replaced by a landscape of paranoia and wonder. The Silver Bridge, which connected the town to Canoga, Ohio, stood as a silent sentinel over the river. Its steel girders hummed in the wind, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to sync with the humming in the heads of the witnesses. The sightings of the Mothman continued, at the power plant, over the river, in the backyards of suburban homes. But the creature was becoming a secondary concern. The real mystery lay in the black Cadillacs and the men with the tilted eyes. As Christmas approached, the tension reached a breaking point. The town was festive, but the joy felt forced. The lights on the trees seemed a little too bright, the carols a little too loud. Everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop, and the men in black were still there, watching the bridge, watching the woods, and watching the people, their silent presence a reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only endured. Chapter 4. The Static in the Air. As the calendar turned toward the final days of 1966, a strange, invisible change took hold of Point Pleasant. It was as if the very air had become electrified. The cozy warmth of the holiday season, with its pine-scented candles and glowing hearths, was increasingly interrupted by a technical interference that felt almost sentient. The residents began to notice it in their homes. Television sets, those heavy wooden consoles that were the center of the American living room, began to behave erratically. Without warning, the picture would dissolve into a swirling vortex of snow and horizontal lines. But it wasn't just static. Viewers reported seeing shapes within the fuzz, faint, elongated faces with dark, almond-shaped eyes that seemed to stare back at them from the glass screen. The radio was no better. Local stations would suddenly be overtaken by a sound like 1,000 bees humming in unison. Occasionally, a voice would break through the hum, a high-pitched, mechanical cadence that spoke in a language no one could recognize. It was a series of clicks and elongated vowels that sounded like a song played in reverse. Mary Heyer, sitting in her office at the Messenger, found her typewriter keys sticking for no apparent reason. The ribbon would tangle, and sometimes, when she returned to her desk after a cup of coffee, she would find a single sentence typed over and over again on the page. The frequency is changing. She wasn't the only one experiencing the strange grip of technology. In the local diner, the jukebox would start playing on its own at 3 in the morning, long after the last customer had left. It wouldn't play the popular hits of the day. It would settle on a scratchy, forgotten blues record, the needle jumping in a rhythmic, pulsing way that matched the heartbeat of the town. The men in black were seen more frequently during these outages. They seemed to thrive in the static. A local mechanic reported seeing one of the dark Cadillacs parked near a telephone relay tower on the outskirts of town. He watched as a man in a charcoal suit stepped out, holding a small black box with a flickering red light. The man didn't look at the tower. He looked at the ground as if he were listening to the vibrations of the earth. When the mechanic yelled out to ask if he needed help, the man simply turned his head, not with a jerk but with a slow, fluid rotation, and stared. The mechanic's car engine immediately died and his radio erupted in a scream of white noise. This was the cozy spooky reality of West Virginia that winter. You could be sitting in your favorite armchair, wrapped in a wool blanket, and suddenly feel the air grow cold and the lights dim, knowing that something was moving through the wires of your home. Chapter 5. The shadow over the TNT area. The heart of the mystery remained the TNT area. This sprawling wasteland of over 8,000 acres was a labyrinth of overgrown roads and abandoned bunkers. In the summer, it was a place for teenagers to hide and explore. But in the winter of 1966, it became a forbidden kingdom. The fog in the TNT area was different from the river mist. It was thick, yellow-tinged, and smelled of old gunpowder and wet sulfur. It clung to the ground, obscuring the rusted doors of the igloos where the military once stored explosives. Witnesses who braved the area spoke of seeing the Mothman perched atop the high chimneys of the abandoned power plant. It stood like a gargoyle, its massive wings folded against its back, its red eyes piercing the yellow fog like twin embers. It didn't hunt. It didn't attack. It simply watched, but the Mothman wasn't alone in the ruins. One evening, a group of hunters tracked what they thought was a deer into the heart of the TNT area. They found themselves near bunker number 13. The air was unnervingly still. Not a bird chirped, not a twig snapped. Then they saw them. 3 men in black suits were standing in a perfect triangle around one of the rusted vents of the bunker. They weren't speaking. They were holding their hands out, palms down, over the vent. A faint blue luminescence was rising from the hole in the ground, illuminating their waxen faces from below. The hunters froze. One of them, a man named Thomas, raised his flashlight. As the beam hit the men, they didn't scatter. They didn't even squint. They looked toward the light with an expression of mild curiosity, as if Thomas were an interesting insect they had never seen before. Then the sound started. It was a low-frequency throb that felt like it was being generated inside Thomas's own chest. It grew louder and louder until the hunters had to drop their rifles and cover their ears. When the sound reached a crescendo, a flash of white light blinded them. When their vision cleared, the men were gone. The blue light was gone. The only thing remaining was the smell of ozone and a single black feather, too large for any bird known to West Virginia, lying on the frost-covered grass. Thomas took the feather home and put it in a shoebox. The next morning, the shoebox was empty. There was no sign of a break-in, no torn cardboard. The feather had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only a faint, oily stain on the bottom of the box. The town felt like it was being slowly consumed by a different dimension. The boundaries between our world and their world were no longer firm. People were seeing things in their peripheral vision, shadowy figures that would vanish when they turned their heads. The cozy safety of the home was being invaded by the spooky reality of a universe that was far more crowded than anyone had suspected. Chapter 6. The Prophet of the Airwaves. As 1967 dawned, a new figure entered the fray. He wasn't a man in a suit, but a voice on the shortwave radio. He called himself the Messenger, and his broadcasts were picked up by hobbyists all across the Ohio River Valley. The Messenger spoke in a calm, soothing tone, much like the voice of a late-night jazz DJ. He would talk about the weather, the river levels, and then without a transition, he would begin to list names and dates. Mr. Henderson, the voice would say through the static. The blue car will not start on Tuesday. Watch the bridge. The silver is cold. Those who were mentioned in the broadcasts reported that the predictions were always true. Mr. Henderson's blue car did fail on Tuesday. Another woman was warned about a fire in her kitchen and managed to extinguish it just in time. John Keel, still stationed at the Low Hotel, spent his nights listening to these broadcasts. He began to suspect that the messenger was not a human at all, but a localized intelligence, an AI or a consciousness that had tapped into the town's communication grid. They are preparing us, Keel wrote in his journals. The sightings, the men in black, the radio voices. It's all a form of psychological conditioning. They are breaking down our sense of reality so they can move in. The atmosphere in Point Pleasant was now one of hyper-awareness. Every bird was a potential Mothman. Every dark car was a potential Cadillac. Every phone call was a potential message from the stars. The cozy rhythm of life, the Sunday church services, the high school basketball games, the morning coffee at the diner, was now performed against a backdrop of cosmic dread. People leaned into their traditions more than ever, seeking comfort in the mundane. They baked more pies, they visited their neighbors more often, they spent more time on their porches. It was a collective effort to keep the shadows at bay, but the shadows were patient. They didn't need to rush. They had already occupied the town's thoughts, its dreams, and its airwaves. The men in black were seen less frequently in the center of town, but they were spotted on the hills, standing like statues against the winter sky. They were waiting for the spring. They were waiting for the anniversary. They were waiting for the bridge to groan. And in the quiet of the night, when the river was high and the wind was cold, the residents of Point Pleasant would lie in their beds and listen. They would listen for the hum in the wires, the tap on the glass, and the distant, rhythmic flapping of wings that sounded like a heart beating in the dark. Chapter 7. The Innocents and the Observers. By the early spring of 1967, the mystery had begun to drift from the woods and the high-voltage towers into the very playgrounds and backyards of Point Pleasant. While the adults carried a heavy, silent burden of paranoia, the children of the town were experiencing the phenomenon in a way that was both more direct and strangely more serene. It was a cozy sort of terror, where the impossible was becoming a part of their daily play. Children are often the first to notice when the frequency of a place changes. They are not yet blinded by the rigid expectations of what should be. To a child in Point Pleasant that year, a tall man in a dark suit standing perfectly still by a swing set was not necessarily a threat. He was simply a new odd fixture of the landscape, like a new tree or a strange dog. Reports began to filter into Mary Hyer's office about strange playmates in the parks. A young boy named Bobby, only 7 years old, told his mother about the shiny man who sat on the bench while he played near the river. "He doesn't have a mouth, Mom," Bobby had said quite casually while eating his afternoon cookies. "He talks with his eyes. He told me the water is going to be very high soon." When Bobby's mother went to the window, she saw a man in a black suit walking slowly away toward the silver bridge. He didn't walk like a man in a hurry. His movements were fluid, almost like he was sliding across the grass. Most unsettling of all was that despite the muddy banks of the Ohio River, his shoes remained a pristine, polished black, reflecting the gray sky like twin mirrors. These encounters with the youth were different from the cold interrogations the adults faced. To the children, the men in black often gave small gifts. These weren't toys or candies, but strange, geometric objects, small cubes of a translucent material that felt warm to the touch and hummed when held to the ear. One little girl, Sarah, showed her father a penny she had been given by a man in a tall black hat. The coin was not copper, nor was it silver. It was a deep, iridescent purple, and it had no face or date. Instead, it was etched with a series of interlocking circles that seemed to shift and move if you looked at them for too long. Sarah's father, a sturdy man who worked at the steel mill, felt a wave of nausea just holding the object. He tried to throw it into the river, but when he opened his hand to toss it, the coin was gone. It hadn't fallen, it had simply vanished from his palm. The schoolyard watchers, the local elementary school, became a focal point for these silent observations. Teachers began to notice black Cadillacs parked at the edge of the school property during recess. The cars never moved. No one ever got out. They simply sat there, their tinted windows hiding whoever or whatever was inside. The atmosphere during these times was thick with a cozy, spooky tension. The children would play their games of tag and jump rope, their laughter ringing out in the crisp spring air while the dark sentinels watched from the periphery. It felt like a protective custody that no one had asked for. One afternoon, a teacher named Martha decided she had seen enough. She walked toward the fence to confront the driver of the black sedan. As she approached, the air began to vibrate. She felt a tingling sensation in her teeth, a metallic taste filling her mouth. The closer she got, the slower her movements became, as if she were walking through a pool of heavy oil. The window of the Cadillac rolled down, not with a mechanical whine, but in total silence. Inside sat a man who looked like he was made of plastic. His skin was too smooth, his hair too black, and his eyes were covered by large, wraparound sunglasses that looked like the compound eyes of an insect. He didn't look at Martha. He looked at the children. "They are the seeds," the man said. His voice didn't come from his throat. It sounded like it was being broadcast from the car's dashboard. "The harvest is not yet, but the soil must be monitored." Martha tried to speak, but her voice failed her. She could only watch as the window rolled back up and the Cadillac glided away, leaving no tire marks on the gravel. When she returned to the classroom, she found that all the clocks had stopped at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon. The dreams of the town. As the month of April progressed, the cozy nights in Point Pleasant were invaded by a collective dreaming. Neighbors would gather at the local pharmacy or the hardware store and realize they had all shared the same vision the night before. They dreamed of the Silver Bridge. In the dreams, the bridge was not made of steel, but of light. It stretched across the river like a glowing ribbon, but instead of cars, it was crowded with people walking toward the Ohio side. Above them, the Mothman circled, its red eyes casting a bloody glow over the water. And standing at either end of the bridge were the men in black, holding long, silver staffs that pulsed with a rhythmic blue light. These dreams were not nightmares in the traditional sense. They were calm, orderly, and filled with a sense of inevitability. People woke up feeling not terrified but profoundly sad, as if they were mourning something that hadn't happened yet. "It's the bridge," Mary Heyer wrote in her private diary. "Everything comes back to the bridge. The men in black aren't here for the creature, they're here for the span. They're watching the iron, they're listening to the bolts." The town's relationship with the Silver Bridge began to change. Once a symbol of pride and connection, it was now viewed with a lingering suspicion. People would drive across it a little faster than they used to. They would keep their windows rolled up, even on the warm spring days, trying to shut out the low, melodic humming of the wind through the suspension chains. The cozy spooky vibe was reaching a fever pitch. The dogwoods were in bloom, their white petals like drifts of snow on the green hills, but the beauty felt fragile. It felt like a stage set that was being dismantled from the back, one piece at a time. The men in black were no longer just visitors. They were the new neighbors. They were seen at the local grocery store, standing in the aisles but never buying food. They were seen at the gas station, standing by the pumps but never filling a tank. They were a part of the fabric of Point Pleasant, a dark thread woven into the colorful tapestry of a 1960s river town. And as the sun set each evening, casting long, purple shadows across the Ohio River, the residents would look toward the Silver Bridge and see the silhouettes of the dark Cadillacs parked on the overlooks, their headlights off, their engines silent, waiting for the moment when the harvest would begin. Chapter 8: The Badge and the Beyond. By the month of May 1967, the mystery had grown too large for the shadows of the TNT area to contain. It began to seep into the very halls of authority. The local police department and the Mason County Sheriff's Office, usually occupied with the quiet, predictable troubles of a river town, stray cattle, minor traffic bumps, or the occasional rowdy Saturday night, found themselves facing a reality that their training manuals had never anticipated. The atmosphere in the station house was no longer one of cozy camaraderie. The officers sat at their heavy oak desks, the scent of stale coffee and tobacco smoke hanging in the air, but the conversation had turned hushed. They were no longer just lawmen. They were witnesses to a breakdown in the natural order. Sheriff George Johnson was a man of steady nerves and a practical mind. He had lived in the valley all his life and knew the woods like the back of his hand. But his deputies were coming to him with reports that made his skin crawl. It wasn't just the sightings of the big bird, as some called it. It was the interaction with the men in the black Cadillacs. One deputy, a young man named Miller, reported a late-night encounter on Route 2. He had pulled over to assist a vehicle that appeared to be stalled on the shoulder. It was, of course, a black Cadillac. As Miller approached with his flashlight, he noticed the car had no license plates, not even a temporary tag. I knocked on the window. Miller told the sheriff, his hands trembling slightly as he held his coffee mug. The glass didn't feel like glass. It felt warm like skin. And when the driver rolled it down, I didn't see a face at first. I saw a reflection of myself, but I looked older, gray, like I was looking at my own ghost. The driver had asked Miller for directions to a disposal site. That didn't exist. When Miller tried to explain that there was no such place, the man simply stared at him with eyes that remained wide and unblinking, even in the harsh glare of the flashlight. The man then reached out and touched Miller's badge. "The metal is pure," the stranger had whispered, "but the heart is fragile." The Cadillac then accelerated away with a sound like a rushing wind, leaving Miller standing in the middle of the road with a badge that had turned a dull, leaden gray. When he got back to the station, the silver plating of his badge had completely vanished, leaving behind a pitted, ancient-looking piece of tin. The physical toll, it wasn't just the equipment that was changing. The people of Point Pleasant were beginning to suffer from a strange set of physical symptoms that the local doctors couldn't explain. It started with Mothman eyes, a painful inflammation of the conjunctiva that felt like sand had been rubbed into the sockets. Many who had seen the creature or the men in black complained of a burning sensation that lasted for weeks. But as the spring deepened, the symptoms became more systemic. Residents reported a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. It was a sleepy kind of dread. People would sit down for a moment in their cozy living rooms and fall into a trance-like state for hours, waking up with no memory of the passage of time. There were also the headaches. A low, vibrating thrum that seemed to originate from the base of the skull. It was most intense near the Silver Bridge. One afternoon, a group of women at a local bridge club all experienced a simultaneous nosebleed. They were sitting in a sun-drenched parlor, surrounded by the scent of lemon polish and tea cakes, when the room suddenly went silent. The birds outside stopped singing. The grandfather clock in the hall missed a beat. And then, as if on cue, a thin trickle of blood began to run from each of their noses. "We didn't feel pain," one of the women later told Mary Heyer. "We just felt hollow, like something had been sucked out of the room, like we were being emptied." The men in black seemed to be the source of this draining energy. Whenever they were spotted near a house, the occupants would report that their batteries would die, their milk would sour overnight, and their house plants would wither and turn black within hours. The visitors were like heat sinks for life, absorbing the vitality of the town and leaving behind a cold, sterile vacuum. The records of the unseen. Sheriff Johnson began to keep a private file, separate from the official logs. In it, he tracked the movement of the black Cadillacs. He realized they were moving in a pattern, a slow, deliberate spiral that was tightening around the center of the town. He also noted the disappearances, not of people, but of things. A local museum reported that a collection of Shawnee artifacts had vanished from a locked display case. A surveyor found that his metal markers had been pulled from the ground and replaced with small, obsidian-like stones. Even the library was affected. Books on local history were found with pages missing, specifically the pages dealing with the Cornstalk Curse and the ancient burials along the river, there erasing the tracks. The sheriff whispered to himself one night as he sat alone in his office. They're making sure that when they leave, there won't be anything left to prove they were ever here. The cozy, spooky atmosphere was now tinged with a sense of mourning. The town felt like it was being prepared for a funeral. The men in black were the undertakers, moving through the streets with their silent cars and their waxen faces, ensuring that the transition was orderly and quiet. But the Mothman remained the wild card. It continued to appear, a screeching, winged herald of the chaos to come. It would dive-bomb cars on the bridge and peer into second-story windows with its glowing red eyes. It was the scream that broke the silence the men in black were trying so hard to maintain. As May gave way to June, the heat began to rise in the valley. The air became thick and humid, making the scent of ozone even more pungent. The residents of Point Pleasant stayed indoors more, keeping their curtains drawn and their doors bolted. The cozy safety of their homes was now a fortress against an invader that could walk through walls and speak through the radio. And every night the black Cadillacs would gather at the riverbank, their headlights reflecting off the dark water of the Ohio, watching the silver bridge as it swayed gently in the warm night breeze. They were waiting for the solstice. They were waiting for the moment when the frequency would finally reach its peak. Chapter 9. The Grinning Man and the Summer of Static. June of 1967 brought a heavy, suffocating heat to the Ohio River Valley. It was a summer where the air felt like a wet wool blanket, and the usual, cozy sounds of Point Pleasant, the screen doors slamming, the distant ring of bicycle bells, the chirping of crickets, were drowned out by a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate within the very soil. The vegetation in the valley grew with an unnatural, aggressive speed. The kudzu and ivy draped over the abandoned buildings of the TNT area like heavy green velvet, concealing the rusted doors and the secrets within. But even in this lush, green world, there was a sense of decay. The flowers in the town square would bloom and then turn to a grayish ash within a single afternoon, as if the life were being siphoned out of them by an invisible straw. It was during this sweltering month that the figure known as Indrid Cold began to move from the shadows of telephone calls into the physical world. The locals called him the Grinning Man. He was first spotted by a family driving along a back road near the river. He was standing in the middle of a field of tall grass, wearing a suit of a reflective, blue-green material that shimmered like a beetle's wing. He was tall, perhaps over 6 feet, and his face was fixed in a wide, frozen smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't wave, he didn't move. He simply stood there, grinning at the passing cars with a terrifying, static intensity. Whenever Indrid Cold was seen, the men in black were never far behind. It was as if he were the master of ceremonies and they were his silent, charcoal-clad ushers. The interview in the dark. John Keel, whose health was beginning to suffer from the constant stress and the strange, Mothman eyes, inflammation, finally had a face-to-face encounter that would haunt his journals for decades. He had been followed all day by a black Cadillac with a license plate that seemed to change numbers every time he looked at it in the rearview mirror. Eventually, he pulled over at a scenic overlook near the river, the water of the Ohio flowing like liquid lead below. A man stepped out of the Cadillac. He wasn't wearing a suit but a simple coverall of a strange, seamless fabric. He approached Keel's car and leaned against the door. "The atmospheric pressure is high today, John," the man said. His voice was like a recording being played at the wrong speed, warped, yet perfectly intelligible. "Who are you?" Keel asked, his hand tightening around his notepad. "Are you with the government? Are you with the people who made that thing in the woods?" The man laughed, a dry, rattling sound like dead leaves blowing across a porch. "Government, we were here when the river was a trickle in the mud. We were here when the mounds were built. We are the architects of the silence." He leaned closer, and Keel noticed that the man had no eyelashes and no visible pores on his skin. He smelled of ozone and scorched copper. "The bridge is a tuning fork, John," the stranger whispered. "The vibration is reaching the correct pitch. When the note is struck, the window will close and we will take our harvest. You should go home. This is not a story for a man who wants to grow old." The man turned and walked back to his car. As the Cadillac pulled away, the radio in Keel's car, which had been turned off, suddenly flared to life, playing a high-pitched melodic whistling that made his ears bleed. He sat there for a long time, watching the sun set over the hills, feeling the cozy spooky peace of the valley curdle into something far more ancient and indifferent. The mystery of the missing records. While Keel was dealing with the grinning man, Mary Hyre was discovering a more terrestrial form of interference. She had been trying to research the history of the Silver Bridge, looking for any record of past Mothman sightings during its construction in the late 1920s. She found that the town's archives had been ransacked. It wasn't a violent burglary. It was a surgical removal. Files regarding the bridge's steel composition, the original engineering blueprints, and the death records of the men who built it were gone. In their place were small, rectangular pieces of black plastic that emitted a faint, pulsing heat. Mary brought one of these plastic slips to a local jeweler, hoping he could tell her what it was. The jeweler, an old man who had seen everything in Point Pleasant, took one look at it through his loupe and dropped it. "That's not stone, Mary," he whispered, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. "And it's not plastic. It's living. Look at the edges." Under the magnifying glass, the edges of the black slip were moving, tiny cilia-like structures waving in the air as if they were breathing. It was a piece of technology that was also a biological entity, a silent monitor left behind by the men in black to record the town's reaction to their presence. Mary realized then that the town of Point Pleasant was no longer a town. It was a laboratory. Every resident, from the sheriff to the children in the schoolyard, was a specimen. The cozy life they led was the controlled environment, and the Mothman and the men in black were the variables being introduced to see how the subjects would react. The July solstice. As July arrived, the sightings of the Mothman reached a frantic pace. It was no longer confined to the TNT area. It was seen perched on the roof of the courthouse, its red eyes glowing like flares in the night. It was seen hovering over the Silver Bridge, its wingspan stretching across the entire width of the two-lane road. The men in black were now seen in groups of 3, standing on the street corners at noon, their dark suits absorbing the summer sun until they seemed to shimmer with heat. They didn't speak to anyone, but their presence caused a localized quiet, where no birds would sing and no dogs would bark. The spooky Nature of the town was now its primary characteristic. The cozy elements, the summer picnics, the river festivals, the baseball games, felt hollow and performative. People were going through the motions of life while constantly looking over their shoulders. Sheriff Johnson reported that his deputies were finding nests in the woods, large circular depressions in the earth where the grass had been scorched and turned into a glass-like substance. Inside these circles, they found strange, discarded objects: silver gloves with too many fingers, small glass spheres filled with a swirling green gas, and maps of the Ohio River Valley that showed towns and roads that didn't exist. The frequency was indeed changing. The hum in the air was now a constant physical pressure that made people's heads ache and their skin itch. The Silver Bridge began to emit a low-frequency groan, a sound of stressed metal that the engineers said was just the heat, but the locals knew better. The bridge was singing. It was responding to the vibration of the men in black and their dark Cadillacs. It was becoming a bridge not just between West Virginia and Ohio, but between the seen and the unseen. And in the middle of it all, Indrid Cold continued to grin. He was seen at the local county fair, standing by the Ferris wheel, his blue-green suit reflecting the neon lights. He watched the children scream with delight as they spun through the air, his wide, frozen smile a reminder that the harvest was drawing near. The town of Point Pleasant was a house of cards, and the wind was starting to pick up. The men in black were standing back, their hands in their pockets, waiting for the first card to fall. Chapter 10. The Autumn of Falling Leaves and Rising Fears. As September of 1967 arrived, the sweltering humidity of the summer began to break, replaced by a crisp, biting chill that felt premature. The leaves on the oaks and maples that lined the Ohio River did not turn their usual brilliant reds and golds. Instead, they withered into a sickly, charcoal gray before drifting silently to the damp earth. The cozy transition to autumn, usually marked by the smell of wood smoke and the excitement of high school football, was replaced by an atmosphere of profound, watchful stillness. The men in black were no longer merely observers on the periphery. They began to move with a new sense of urgency. The black Cadillacs were seen less in the residential areas and more frequently parked in geometric patterns around the base of the Silver Bridge. They sat there in the early morning fog, their engines silent, their headlights off, like a row of dark coffins waiting for a procession. Mary Hyre noticed that the nature of the messages she received had changed. For months she had dealt with cryptic phone calls and strange visitors. Now the warnings were becoming physical. One morning she arrived at her office to find a single, large envelope on her desk. It wasn't paper. It felt like a thin sheet of cold lead. Inside was a series of photographs. They weren't photos of the Mothman or the men in black. They were aerial shots of Point Pleasant, but they were taken from an impossible height, showing the town as a tiny, fragile grid of lights against a vast, consuming darkness. On the back of the final photo, written in a shimmering silver ink that seemed to move under the light, were the words, "The weight is too much for the iron." Mary felt a wave of coldness wash over her. She knew they were talking about the Silver Bridge. She took the photos to the town council, but when she opened the envelope in front of the mayor, the sheets were blank. The images had evaporated the moment they were exposed to the fluorescent lights of the town hall. "It's the stress, Mary," the mayor had said, his voice kind but dismissive. "We're all tired. This bird business has everyone seeing ghosts." But Mary knew better. The cozy facade of the town's leadership was cracking. Behind the mayor's smile, she saw the same bloodshot eyes and twitching hands that plagued everyone else in the valley. The silent interrogations. In October, the high strangeness took a more personal turn for the residents. People began to report the silence. It would happen in the middle of a grocery store or a church service. Suddenly, all sound would cease. The rustle of clothes, the sound of breathing, the hum of the refrigerator, everything would vanish into a perfect, pressurized vacuum. During these silences, a man in a black suit would walk through the crowd. He wouldn't speak. He would simply stop in front of an individual and stare at them for several minutes. Witnesses described feeling as though their entire life story was being read or downloaded. Then, as quickly as it started, the sound would rush back in with a painful pop, and the man in black would be gone. Sheriff Johnson's deputy, Miller, experienced a silence while sitting in his patrol car. He looked into his rearview mirror and saw a man in a black hat sitting in his backseat. Miller couldn't move his arms or legs. He could only watch as the man reached forward and placed a cold, waxen hand on Miller's shoulder. "The bridge is tired, deputy," the man whispered. "It wants to sleep in the river. Do not be on the iron when the sun goes down in the 12th month." Miller tried to radio for help, but the microphone felt like a piece of dead wood in his hand. When the silence broke, Miller was alone in the car. His uniform shoulder was frosted with a layer of fine white ice, even though the heater was running at full blast. The gathering at the Low Hotel. John Keel, now a permanent fixture at the Low Hotel, became the unofficial center of the town's resistance. People would come to his room at night, clutching mugs of warm cider, seeking comfort in the cozy safety of numbers. They would swap stories of the grinning man and the strange lights over the TNT area, their voices hushed as if they were afraid the walls themselves were listening. Keel noticed that the hotel's lobby was now constantly occupied by at least 3 men in suits. They sat in the shadows, their dark glasses reflecting the flickering fire in the hearth. They never checked in. They never checked out. They were simply part of the architecture now. One evening, Indrid Cold himself was seen entering the hotel. He didn't use the door. He simply appeared standing by the front desk. He leaned over and whispered something to the night clerk, a woman named Connie. Connie's eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed in a dead faint. When she woke up, she couldn't remember her own name, but she could speak perfect, fluent Greek, a language she had never studied. She spent the rest of the night writing complex mathematical equations on the hotel's stationery, her hand moving with a blurred, mechanical speed. "They are calculating the collapse," Keel noted in his diary. "They aren't here to save us. They are here to measure the impact. They are the scientists of our catastrophe." The sense of spooky inevitability was now so thick it was hard to breathe. The town was waiting for December. The prophecy of the 12th month had spread through the grapevine until it was a common, terrifying knowledge. People began to make excuses to avoid the bridge. They would take the long way around, driving miles out of their way to cross the river at Huntington or Parkersburg. But the Silver Bridge seemed to have a gravitational pull. People found themselves driving toward it as if they were in a trance. They would snap out of it only when they were halfway across the span, the steel girders vibrating beneath their tires with a low, mournful groan. The final warning. On the last day of November, the Mothman made its most spectacular appearance. It wasn't a fleeting glimpse in the woods. It appeared at high noon, perched atop the very highest point of the Silver Bridge's suspension towers. Thousands of people saw it. It stood there for 3 hours, its wings spread wide, a dark, feathered cross against the pale autumn sky. It didn't move. It didn't screech. It just cast a long, jagged shadow over the cars below. The men in black stood on the banks of the river, their black Cadillacs lined up like a funeral cortege. They weren't looking at the creature. They were looking at their watches. The cozy life of Point Pleasant was over. The town had been prepared. The frequency had been set. The witnesses had been silenced or discredited. The stage was set for the final act of 1967. As the sun set on that cold November day, the Mothman took flight, its massive wings making a sound like a silk sheet snapping in the wind. It flew straight up, disappearing into the clouds. And for the first time in over a year, the air in Point Pleasant was perfectly, terrifyingly silent. The humming had stopped. The static on the radio was gone. The spooky tension had reached its zenith. The town held its breath, waiting for the 1st of December and the beginning of the end. Chapter 11. The Frozen Watch and the December Chill. December of 1967 arrived in Point Pleasant not with a festive flurry, but with a cold that felt clinical. It was a dry, biting frost that seemed to seep through the walls of even the coziest homes, turning the windows into opaque sheets of white fern-like patterns. The usual warmth of the holiday season, the colorful lights on Main Street, the smell of roasting hams, the sound of church bells, felt thin and fragile, a paper-thin mask stretched over a face of stone. The atmosphere was no longer just spooky. It was expectant. The men in black had changed their behavior once again. They were no longer prowling the streets or knocking on doors. Instead, they had become stationary. On every street corner leading toward the river, a man in a black suit stood perfectly still. They didn't wear coats despite the sub-zero temperatures. They stood in their thin, charcoal gray suits, their hands at their sides, watching the traffic flow toward the Silver Bridge. When drivers passed them, they felt a sudden, sharp drop in the temperature inside their cars. The heaters would blow cold air for a few seconds, and the radio would emit a single, low-frequency tone that vibrated in the driver's teeth. John Keel, whose health was now failing rapidly, described the sensation in his notes as the world holding its breath before a scream. He spent his days sitting by the window of the Low Hotel, watching the black Cadillacs. They had moved to the high ridges overlooking the valley. There were dozens of them now, their polished black frames catching the pale winter sun. They looked like a fleet of obsidian ships anchored on a sea of dead grass. The disappearing witnesses. As the middle of the month approached, a strange phenomenon began to occur. The people who had been the most vocal about their sightings, the ones who had spoken to Mary Heyer and John Keel, began to vanish. They didn't disappear into thin air, they simply left. A family who had seen the Mothman in their backyard packed their bags in the middle of the night and drove away, leaving their Christmas tree decorated and their dinner still on the table. When the neighbors went to check on them, they found the house perfectly cozy and warm, but the family was gone. There were no tire tracks in the frost-covered driveway. Others simply forgot. A man who had photographed the grinning man in July now claimed he had never heard of such a thing. He looked at his own photographs and said they were just blurs of light. His eyes, which had been bright and curious, were now dull and flat, similar to the eyes of the men in black. The erasure is nearly complete, Mary Heyer wrote in her final column before the collapse. They are cleaning the slate. They are making sure that when the event happens, there will be no context. It will look like a simple accident of engineering, but we know better. We have seen the observers. We have heard the hum. Mary herself felt the pressure. She found herself being followed not by cars, but by shadows. She would walk down the street and see her own shadow stretching out toward the river, even when the sun was behind her. The shadows would whisper in a language that sounded like the rushing of the Ohio River, a cold, liquid dialect of the bridge and the deep, the solitude of the Silver Bridge. On the 15th of December, the air over the valley turned a strange, bruised shade of purple. The wind died down completely, leaving the river as flat and reflective as a dark mirror. The Silver Bridge, with its elegant suspension chains and narrow two-lane road, stood in the center of the silence. The cozy rhythm of the Friday afternoon was in full swing. People were coming home from work in Ohio, their cars filled with grocery bags and Christmas presents. They were thinking about their evening plans, their families, and the warmth of their homes. But as they drove onto the bridge, they noticed something strange. The men in black were gone. The sentinels who had stood on the street corners for weeks had vanished. The black Cadillacs on the ridges were gone. The grinning man was nowhere to be seen. For the first time in over a year, the town of Point Pleasant felt empty of its observers, but the silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of a theater after the lights go out, but before the film begins. At 5 o'clock in the evening, the traffic on the bridge was bumper to bumper. The sun had set, and the red taillights of the cars created a long, glowing chain across the water. The steel of the bridge, stressed by 40 years of use and the unnatural vibrations of the past year, began to moan. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a sleepy groan, a slow settling of metal against metal. A woman in a station wagon near the center of the span looked out her window. She saw a pair of large, red eyes glowing beneath the water of the river. They weren't moving, they were just watching from the depths. At the same time, she heard a high-pitched, melodic whistling through her radio. Then the pin snapped. The collapse was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow-motion folding of the world. The suspension chain on the north side of the bridge gave way, and the roadway began to twist like a ribbon. The cars, filled with people and their holiday dreams, slid into the dark, freezing water of the Ohio. There was no scream from the Mothman. There was no flash of light from the men in black. There was only the sound of the river taking what had been promised to it. The aftermath in the mist, in the hours following the collapse, as the emergency lights of ambulances and fire trucks flickered against the dark water, the cozy, spooky nature of Point Pleasant returned for one final, chilling moment. Witnesses on the bank, watching the rescue divers, reported seeing 3 black Cadillacs parked on the Ohio side of the river. The men inside weren't helping. They weren't calling for aid. They were sitting perfectly still, their headlights illuminating the wreckage in the water. When a reporter tried to approach them, the cars turned around in perfect unison and drove into the darkness. They didn't leave toward the highway. They seemed to simply dissolve into the heavy mist that was rising from the river. The next morning, the town woke up to a world that was fundamentally changed. The bridge was gone. 46 people were dead or missing. The mystery that had haunted the valley for 13 months had reached its violent, tragic conclusion. The men in black never returned to Point Pleasant. The Mothman was never seen again in the TNT area. The grinning man vanished into the legends of the 1960s. John Keel left the Low Hotel a few days later. He walked through the cozy lobby where the fire was still burning in the hearth, but the air felt hollow. He realized that the harvest had been taken. The observers had finished their study, recorded the results, and moved on to the next window area. As he drove away from the town, he looked in his rearview mirror. For a fleeting second, he saw a tall figure with wings perched on the "Welcome to Point Pleasant" sign. But when he blinked, it was just a shadow cast by the morning sun. The story of the Mothman and the men in black became a ghost story, a tale told on cold winter nights to keep children away from the river. But for those who lived through it, it was a reminder that we are never truly alone, and that the cozy world we build is always being watched by eyes that do not blink and by men who wear the dark like a suit. Chapter 12. The After Shadows and the Long Reflection. The winter that followed the collapse of the Silver Bridge was the quietest in the history of the Ohio River Valley. It was a silence that felt heavy and thick, like the layers of silt settling over the cars at the bottom of the river. The cozy warmth of the town had been hollowed out, replaced by a collective grief that was whispered in the aisles of the grocery store and over the fences of the small, white houses. Point Pleasant was no longer a place of mystery. It was a place of memory. The 1960s were drawing to a close, and with them the strange, electric tension that had gripped the valley seemed to dissipate. But it didn't vanish entirely. It moved into the after shadows, those quiet, lingering moments where the past refuses to stay buried. Mary Heyer continued to sit at her desk at the Messenger, but she no longer looked for Mothman sightings. She looked for the people who had been left behind. She noticed that the spooky symptoms didn't disappear with the bridge. The headaches remained for some. The Mothman eyes left behind a sensitivity to light that made many residents wear sunglasses even on the grayest winter days. And then there were the dreams. For years after 1967, the people of Point Pleasant dreamed of the water. They didn't dream of the crash or the fear. They dreamed of the river as a vast, silver road, and they dreamed of the men in black standing on the far shore, waving a slow, rhythmic goodbye. It was a sleepy, kind of haunting, a gentle reminder that they had been part of something that moved beyond the understanding of their cozy, terrestrial lives. The final trace of the observers. In the spring of 1968, as the first green shoots began to push through the mud of the TNT area, a group of children found something in the woods. It was near the site of the old power plant, hidden beneath a pile of rusted iron and dead leaves. It was a small, black suitcase. The suitcase was made of a material that felt like leather, but was as cold as dry ice. It had no handle and no latches. When the children brought it to the local police station, the officers found that they couldn't open it with any tool in the shop. Saws would blunt against its surface. Drills would simply slide off as if the suitcase were made of liquid. They left it on a table in the evidence room. That night the station's radio went haywire, broadcasting a series of long, melodic tones that sounded like a choir of whales. By the time the morning shift arrived, the suitcase was gone. In its place was a fine white powder that smelled of ozone and lavender. The powder was sent to a laboratory in Washington, but the results came back as inconclusive. It was a substance that possessed no atomic weight, a physical impossibility that was tucked away in a file and forgotten by everyone except the men who had seen it. The legacy of John Keel and the Silver Path. John Keel moved on from Point Pleasant, but Point Pleasant never moved on from him. He spent the rest of his life writing about the superspectrums and the ultraterrestrials. He believed that the men in black and the Mothman were not from another planet, but from another frequency of our own world. A spooky neighbor that we only see when the conditions are exactly right. He often returned to the idea of the cozy spooky balance. He argued that we need the mysteries to remind us that our lives are not just a series of chores and bills. The shadows in the corner of the room, the strange hum on the radio, the man in the charcoal suit who stands a little too still. They are the reminders that the universe is vast, ancient, and deeply, beautifully strange. As the decades passed, the Silver Bridge was replaced by a new modern span called the Silver Memorial Bridge. It is a sturdy, functional structure, but the locals say it doesn't sing like the old one did. The air around it is just air. The water below it is just water. But on the 15th of December every year, the town still gathers. They light candles and stand in the cozy warmth of each other's presence. They look out over the Ohio River and they remember the year when the stars came down to the valley. They remember the red eyes in the dark. They remember the black Cadillacs that glided through the snow. They remember the men who spoke in riddles and the bridge that fell into the deep. The harvest of the heart. As we conclude this long-form journey through the 1960s, we are left with a final reflection. The story of Point Pleasant is not just a story of a tragedy or a monster. It is a story of the human spirit's capacity to face the unknown, the ambient whispers. Of the Mothman and the men in black have faded into the static of history, but the frequency remains. It is the frequency of wonder. It is the realization that even in our most cozy and predictable moments, we are walking on the edge of a great mystery. Robert Richardson, the witnesses of Point Pleasant, and the countless others who have looked into the dark and seen something looking back. They are the keepers of the flame. They remind us to listen to the hum, to watch the shadows, and to always keep a place in our hearts for the spooky truths that lie just beyond the reach of our lamps. The river continues to flow, a dark, silent ribbon through the heart of West Virginia. The trees continue to grow over the ruins of the TNT area. And somewhere in a world that vibrates at a different pitch than our own, the men in black are sitting in their dark Cadillacs, watching the monitors, waiting for the next window to open. Sleep now in the cozy safety of your home. The world is large and the mystery is safe. The night is long, but the morning will always come, bringing with it the familiar and the known. But as you drift into your own dreams, remember the Silver Bridge and the year when the shadows walked among us. The air is still. The hum has faded. The story is told.